I remember that day like it was yesterday. The air was filled with celebration, laughter echoing from every corner of the auditorium, cameras flashing, families embracing with pride and joy. It was my son's graduation day. A day I had been waiting for, dreaming of, and praying over for years. I had worked long hours, sacrificed comfort, skipped meals, and put my own needs on hold, just to make sure he never had to walk the same difficult road I did. That day I woke up extra early. I ironed the best clothes I had, even though they were a little worn at the edges. I did my hair the way he always said he liked it when he was little. I wanted to look good for him, for his moment. My heart was full, overflowing with pride. My son had made it. He was graduating. I sat there in the crowd, holding back tears, clapping till my palms hurt, smiling so wide my cheeks ached. When his name was called, I stood up instinctively, cheering louder than I probably should have. I didn't care. That was my boy. That was my baby. I remembered the nights I held him when he had fevers, the mornings I packed his lunches even when the fridge was almost empty, the times I walked to work in the rain because the bus fare needed to go to his school supplies instead. Every hard moment felt worth it in that instant. Until it wasn't. After the ceremony, they had a little reception for the graduates. Family members were mingling, taking pictures, passing out congratulations. I walked over to him, my heart still swollen with pride. I put my hand on his shoulder and I said, "I'm so proud of you." I said it softly with all the love I had. And he looked at me, this child I raised, this young man I carried with everything in me, and he said in front of his friends, "You don't even know what I graduated with. You're too stupid and uneducated to understand it anyway." Just like that. There was laughter. Not the kind that fills a room with joy, but the kind that stabs you in the chest. I stood there for a second, not quite believing what I had just heard. My ears heard it, but my heart rejected it. My pride collapsed in that moment. I didn't say a word. I just nodded slightly and stepped away. I saw his friends smirking. I saw other parents glance in my direction, some shocked, some embarrassed for me. And I walked out of that room, still holding the gift I had wrapped for him the night before. I can't fully describe the feeling of being broken open in public like that. I had imagined so many versions of that day, but not that one. Not the version where the child I raised with every ounce of love I had would use his achievement as a weapon to shame me. Not the version where I became invisible, less than mocked, on a day that should have been a celebration of everything we had been through together. But you know what hurt even more than the words? The way he said them. Cold. Dismissive. Like I was some inconvenience. Like I hadn't spent years breaking my back to keep him clothed, fed, and in school. Like I hadn't sat up at night figuring out how to stretch $20 into groceries for a week. Like I hadn't taught him how to speak, how to stand, how to be decent. Like I didn't matter. I've been called names before. Life has thrown some tough things my way. But this was different. This came from someone who had my blood. Someone whose future I built with my own two hands. That day I realized something that no diploma, no certificate, no degree can ever teach. Intelligence can open doors, but character decides who you let in. And in that moment he shut the door on me. But I didn't shout. I didn't argue. I didn't demand respect with noise. I left with my silence. 'Cause I believe sometimes silence is the loudest sound in the world. You know, people see a moment like that and they form quick opinions. They see a child in a cap and gown, educated, eloquent, proud, and they assume everything about that picture is success. But what they don't see, what they almost never see, is the years behind that photo. They don't see the grind, the nights of crying behind closed doors, the meals skipped to make rent, or the quiet deals we make with life just to give our children a chance. They don't see me sitting at a kitchen table, lit by a single bulb, reading instructions on how to fill out financial aid forms I barely understood. They don't see the second job I took, cleaning offices at night while he slept, just to afford his textbooks and uniforms. They don't see how many birthdays I let pass with no cake, no celebration, because I needed that extra money for school supplies or bus fare. No one talks about those kinds of sacrifices because they're not shiny. They're not posted on Instagram. They're the quiet, invisible kind. The kind a mother makes without asking for thanks. The kind a parent makes because love doesn't come with conditions. I didn't need my son to become famous or rich. I just wanted him to become a decent man. A man who saw people. A man who remembered, who held his hand when the world felt too big. But life, I've learned, doesn't always give you immediate rewards for those sacrifices. You carry the weight in silence, and sometimes the only thanks you get is the strength of the child you raised. That was enough for me. For a long time that was more than enough. Still, I won't lie to you, it stings. It stings when someone looks at you like your lack of a degree makes you less than. Like your hard-earned wisdom doesn't matter because it wasn't printed on expensive paper. I didn't go to college. I didn't even finish high school the way I wanted to. Not because I wasn't capable, but because life didn't give me the luxury of dreaming that far. I had to grow up too fast. My choices weren't about passion or purpose. They were about survival. When my son was born, my life became all about making sure he didn't have to fight the same battles. I wanted him to dream bigger than I could. I wanted him to learn without hunger in his belly. I wanted him to sit in classrooms where he could ask questions I never had the chance to ask. Everything I gave up willingly. With love. With hope. But the hardest part of sacrifice is that it often goes unseen, unappreciated. People think if you don't have a title or a degree, you don't have value. They look past you. And when that comes from strangers, you swallow it. You keep your head high. But when it comes from your own child, the child you raised through storms, that wound goes deeper than you expect. You start to question, did I fail in how I raised him? Did I give too much without asking for accountability in return? But here's what I've come to understand. Sacrifice doesn't always bloom in the time we expect it to. Sometimes our children don't see us clearly until they've lived a little longer. Sometimes the judgment they hand us comes from a place of ignorance, not cruelty. And sometimes they have to fail on their own before they understand the value of everything we gave up to see them succeed. That day at his graduation, I stood quietly with all my sacrifices wrapped up in a cheap gift bag I brought for him. He didn't take the bag. He didn't take the moment. But I carried it anyway. Because it wasn't just a gift. It was a reminder of all the years I spent making sure he could one day stand on that stage. I may not have walked across a graduation platform, but I've walked through fire. And I'm still standing. Let no one mistake silence for weakness, or sacrifice for stupidity. I may not be educated in the way he is, but I have lived 1,000 lessons that no classroom could ever teach. And if loving my child enough to suffer in silence makes me uneducated, then I'll wear that word with pride. It's a strange thing, how success can sometimes turn into a mirror, not just reflecting who we are, but what we've forgotten. I used to think that when my son made it, when he finally reached the goals we'd both worked so hard for, it would bring us closer. I thought it would be a celebration not just of his effort, but of our journey, of everything we overcame together. But that day I realized something painful. Sometimes success doesn't humble people. Sometimes it makes them forget. When he stood there, surrounded by friends and applause, I saw a version of him I barely recognized. His voice was louder, more confident, but it carried a sharpness I hadn't heard before. There was a distance in his eyes, like he had already stepped out of our world and into a new one where I no longer fit. And when he said those words to me, when he called me stupid and uneducated, it wasn't just a personal insult. It was a dismissal of everything I had ever done for him. It was like he had decided I was no longer worthy to stand beside him. I don't think he understood the weight of what he said. To him, maybe it was just a joke, a careless attempt to show off in front of his peers. But to me it was a knife. Not because I didn't know my own worth, but because I had spent his whole life trying to make sure he never felt small the way I had. And there he was, using his education, his success, as a weapon to cut me down. There's this quiet heartbreak that comes when your child, the one you nurtured and guided, begins to see you as less. Not because you've changed, but because they have. The love is still there, buried somewhere deep, but it's tangled up in ego, in pride, in the illusion that achievement somehow makes them better than the people who helped them get there. And that's the danger of unchecked success. When it isn't balanced with humility, it breeds something ugly. Arrogance, entitlement, forgetfulness. I remember when he was little, he used to watch me do everything. Cooking, fixing things, handling problems with calm and patience. He'd say, "Mama, you're the smartest person I know." And I'd smile not because I believed it, but because I knew he did. Back then, he saw wisdom in my hands, in the way I figured things out without manuals or instruction books. He saw strength in how I never gave up, no matter how tired I was. That admiration, that trust, it used to light me up inside. It made every sacrifice feel like it mattered. But somewhere along the way, as the world praised his grades and celebrated his achievements, that little boy started fading. And in his place stood someone who believed the world now revolved around him. That his titles made him more valuable. That those of us without them were beneath him. And that, more than anything, is what broke my heart. Not the words, but the loss of who he used to be. I think success without gratitude is one of the most dangerous things we can give our children. Because if they grow up believing that what they've earned came only from their own effort, they lose sight of the shoulders they stood on. They forget the nights we stayed up to help them study, the mornings we skipped breakfast so they wouldn't have to. They forget the times we pretended everything was okay, just to give them a sense of security. And worst of all, they begin to see love as something disposable, something that doesn't need to be honored once they've outgrown it. What my son didn't realize that day is that no degree, no success, no applause from a crowd will ever be more valuable than character. And character is built in how you treat people when the spotlight is on you. Especially the people who loved you before the world even knew your name. I stood there quietly after he said those words. Not because I was ashamed, but because I knew that nothing I could say in that moment would matter to him. He was high on the praise, lost in the validation. So I let him have it. I let him shine. But deep inside, I knew that one day, life would humble him. One day, the applause would fade, the stage would go dark, and he'd be left with nothing but the mirror of his own actions. And when that day comes, I hope he remembers. Not just the sacrifices but the love, patience, the humility. I hope he remembers that the people who stood silently behind him were the very reason he ever got to stand in front. There's a big difference between being educated and being wise. And I think that difference often gets lost in moments like the one I experienced. When my son called me stupid and uneducated, I could hear the pride in his voice, the kind that doesn't come from confidence but from comparison. He wasn't just celebrating what he had achieved. He was measuring it against who he thought I wasn't. And in his eyes, because I didn't have degrees or letters after my name, I somehow didn't deserve respect. But let me say something clearly. Education is a beautiful thing. It opens doors, it gives people tools, it pushes the mind. I wanted that for him. I worked hard for him to have that. But what I also hoped he'd learn along the way was that education, without wisdom, can make a person smart enough to succeed, but not wise enough to know how to treat others. Especially the ones who made their success possible. Wisdom is earned differently. It doesn't come with a diploma. It comes through experience, through failure, through watching life fall apart and still finding a way to keep going. Wisdom is what taught me how to stretch $1 into dinner. It's what taught me how to read people, to know when something was wrong just by the way they walked into a room. It's what taught me how to fix a broken pipe with nothing but tape and determination. These are things I didn't learn in a classroom. I learned them in the real world, where the consequences are immediate and the lessons permanent. I never pretended to know everything. In fact, I've spent a lifetime feeling like I didn't know enough. There were moments I wished I had the education I helped my son get. Moments when I walked into a bank or a hospital or a school meeting and felt small, because the words they used sounded foreign and complicated. But every time I walked out of those rooms, I figured it out. Because that's what life taught me. Not to memorize facts, but to solve problems. To endure. To adapt. To survive with grace, even when the world was unkind. So when my son stood there and implied that my value was somehow less because I didn't go to college, I realized he didn't yet understand the difference. He thought intelligence was only about books. That knowledge was only found in lectures. That being able to write a paper meant he was smarter than someone who'd kept a family together without any formal training. But I know better. I know that real intelligence includes humility. That being educated doesn't give anyone the right to look down on someone else. I know that you can be top of your class and still fail in the classroom of life, where compassion, respect, and decency are what truly matter. I've seen men and women with advanced degrees who didn't know how to say, "Thank you," who couldn't hold a conversation without trying to prove they were better than someone else. And I've also seen people with little formal education who carried wisdom so deep it changed the people around them, who could solve a conflict with a few calm words, who knew how to lift others up without needing to be seen doing it. I never raised my son to think he was better than anyone. I raised him to believe that no matter how far he went, he should never forget where he started. That every person has something to teach you, no matter their background. But somewhere along the way, he started to believe that being smart meant being superior. That his education gave him permission to ignore the lessons of decency and gratitude. And that's the danger when people confuse knowledge with wisdom. They forget that the heart has its own kind of intelligence. There are things you can't learn in any school. You can't be taught how to listen deeply to someone in pain. You can't be graded on your ability to love someone when they're at their worst. There's no textbook that tells you how to hold your head high when someone you love tries to humiliate you. That kind of strength, that kind of knowledge, lives in the soul, not the syllabus. So yes, I may not have a degree. I may not be able to speak the way academics do or quote philosophers or write essays that win awards. But I know how to love without limits. I know how to forgive, even when the wound is still fresh. I know how to raise a child with nothing but my bare hands and a heart full of hope. And if that makes me uneducated, then I'll carry that label like a badge. Because I'd rather have wisdom that lifts people up than education that tears them down. When he said those words to me, called me stupid, uneducated, in front of his friends, I could feel the world watching. It was one of those moments where time slows down but the sting hits you all at once. I could have reacted. Believe me, I had every right to. I could have shouted back, told him off, reminded him right there, in front of everyone, of who I am and what I've done for him. But I didn't. Not because I was weak or afraid. I didn't react because I understood something he hadn't learned yet. Sometimes the most powerful response is no response at all. So I let the world judge him. And I mean that quite literally. I didn't defend myself. I didn't plead my case. I didn't follow after him to explain my worth. I stood still, quiet, composed. And in that silence, I watched the faces around us shift. I watched some people turn away, uncomfortable. Others looked at him, not with admiration anymore, but with something closer to disappointment. Because even people who didn't know our story could recognize what just happened. They didn't need the backstory to feel the weight of it. You see, there's something deeply revealing about the way a person treats their parents, especially in moments of celebration. It tells you who they really are when the spotlight is on them. In that moment, my son showed the world that achievement had gone to his head. That somewhere along the road to success, he lost sight of the very foundation that held him up. And I didn't need to say a single word to expose that. He did it all on his own. Letting the world judge him wasn't about shaming him. It was about stepping back and allowing reality to teach the lessons I no longer could. Because no matter how much you love someone, you can't protect them from the consequences of their own actions forever. There comes a time when you have to stop explaining, stop softening the blow, and just let the silence speak. I walked out of that reception alone. I remember holding the gift I had brought him, still wrapped, ribbon still tied. It felt heavier than it was, not because of its contents, but because of everything it symbolized. It held years of work, of worry, of love. And he had no idea. Or maybe he did and just didn't care in that moment. Either way, I didn't go back to hand it to him. I didn't text him afterward asking why. I didn't sit by the phone waiting for an apology. I gave myself the dignity of distance. Because sometimes that's the only way people learn. I know some people would have handled it differently. Maybe they would have lashed out or created a scene. But I've lived long enough to understand the difference between noise and impact. I didn't need to win an argument. I needed him to see what he'd become. And sometimes the only mirror strong enough to reflect someone's true self is the reaction, or lack of it, from those they've hurt. I also knew that people would talk. Word spreads fast, especially when drama is involved. But I wasn't ashamed. Not of myself. If anything, I stood taller in that silence than I ever could have if I had fought back. 'Cause I know who I am. I know what I've endured. And I don't need anyone's applause to validate that. In that moment, I let the world draw its own conclusions. Let his friends wonder what kind of man talks to his mother like that. Let the teachers and families around us see that education without respect is hollow. Let them feel that chill in the air when a mother is disrespected publicly by the child she gave everything to. I didn't have to convince anyone. The truth sat in the silence, clear as day. But more importantly, I let him see it too. I didn't shield him from the judgment of others. I didn't protect his image or step in to smooth things over. Because if he was old enough to call me stupid, then he was old enough to face the weight of those words. And maybe, just maybe, one day he'll look back and realize the damage he caused. Maybe one day he'll wish he could take it back. And maybe he'll remember that I didn't fight him. I simply stepped aside and let the world see him for who he was in that moment. The world has a way of showing people the truth when they least expect it. And on that day, I let it do exactly that. In the days that followed, I sat with a lot of emotions. Anger, sure. Hurt, definitely. But more than anything, I felt this quiet ache, like something sacred had been cracked open. Not just because of what my son said, but because of what it meant, that the love I had poured so endlessly into him had somehow gotten lost along the way. That the child I'd once rocked to sleep now saw me through a lens of judgment, not gratitude. And I had to ask myself the hardest question a parent ever faces. Had I done too much without teaching him to value it? But as I sat in that silence, as I picked up the pieces of that moment, something began to shift. Not just in how I saw him, but in how I saw myself. I started remembering. Not just the pain, but the purpose. I remembered the nights I stayed up, sewing buttons onto his school uniform so he'd look sharp, even when we couldn't afford new clothes. I remembered the mornings I walked him to school with aching feet, smiling the whole way just so he'd start his day with joy. I remembered skipping meals, not for pity, but because I knew his lunchbox needed to be full. I remembered every decision I ever made where the question wasn't, "What do I want?" but "What does he need?" I remembered who I am. And in that remembering, I found something more powerful than the hurt. Found peace. Because when you know the truth about who you are, when you've lived a life full of quiet, consistent love, no one can take that from you. Not even your own child. My worth was never in a diploma. It was never in how many big words I knew or what I wore to his graduation. My worth was in every act of love I gave without expecting anything back. My value lived in the silence between struggles, in the sacrifices I never spoke about. And when you stand on that kind of foundation, you don't crumble when someone tries to cut you down. You stand taller. So I made a decision. I wasn't going to let that moment define me. I wasn't going to carry his words like a wound. I was going to carry them like a lesson. A lesson in letting go. Not of love, but of needing to be understood. Because sometimes the people you love the most won't see you clearly until life brings them to their knees. And that's not your failure. That's their journey. I had to forgive him, not because he asked for it, not because he earned it, but because I needed to be free. Holding on to that pain would have only chained me to the very moment I was trying to rise from. So I forgave him quietly, in the way a mother does when she remembers the child before the pride. Not because it was easy, but because my love has always been bigger than my pain. And I also promised myself something else. That I would stop shrinking my story. That I would stop believing that I needed someone else's validation to feel proud of my life. My story, in all its messy, ordinary, glorious detail, matters. I raised a man. I built a future I never had for myself. I stood in the face of poverty, heartbreak, exhaustion, and fear. And I didn't just survive. I created something from it. Built love. Built a home. There's something powerful that happens when you finally claim your own story, flaws and all. When you stop waiting for someone to say, "You did enough," and instead look in the mirror and say it to yourself. I did enough. More than enough. And if he never says thank you, if he never apologizes, if he never understands what I gave, so be it. I'll still be proud. Because my love was never for applause. It was for him. And I gave it fully. Maybe one day, he'll come to understand. Maybe he'll grow into the kind of man who can sit across from me, with humility in his eyes, and finally see the whole picture. Maybe he won't. That's not something I can control anymore. But what I can control is how I walk forward from here. With dignity, with peace, and with the unshakable truth that I was never stupid. I was never less. I was a mother. I am a mother. And that, in itself, is a kind of wisdom this world still doesn't fully know how to honor.